Today we continue with a series of landscape exchange, which is virtual platform to share the knowledge of current development and transformation of land. Today we would like to focus to urban transformation of contemporary agri-territories, including the city hinterlands and rural countrysides, which is recently a crucial theme remaining in the blind field of architecture. With nearly half of the total land area on the planet is currently dedicated to some form of agricultural production, so that agricultural landscape might be the most urgent field of action to address the problematic of sustainability. Also, architectural discourses remain focused on buildings and cities, while these extended territories are exposed to the rapid and far-reaching transformation with massive social and environmental implications. So for us, it was interesting, how could we as architects react to these changes? What could be architects' role in not just designing, but understanding and describing these terms? How could we define the relationship between the agri-territory and the countryside, the territory and the city, and territory and the field? All these terms we would like to discuss with our guest today, with Milica Topalović. Milica Topalović is an architect, researcher, and associate professor of architecture and territorial planning at ETH Zurich Department of Architecture. Milica Topalović's work has been concerned with territories beyond the city and urgent transformation processes they are exposed to through the movement of capital, social restructuring, and environmental change. With her team and the students at ETH, she undertook a range of territorial studies around the world, as she's saying, in an effort to ecologize architects' approaches to the city and urbanization. So this is just some introduction, but Milica can tell us something more about the lecture and about her projects. And after the lecture, we're gonna start some discussion, so you can write to the chat. We are happy.
Thank you very much, Savka, for that introduction, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm imagining that I'm in Prague, where I have been many years ago, and would have loved to be there again. Thank you also Jana and Michaela, and thank you Norma Space for the invitation. I'm really glad about it. So, as Savka said, I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about agri-territories, or let's say landscapes and territories across the world that are entangled with contemporary cities through the flows of food and water and labor movements and other linkages. And Savka also mentioned, I'd like to talk about the ways that these territories, which include different kind of conditions from the hinterlands, operationalized, industrialized hinterlands to rural countrysides, are exposed to different kind of transformations, and how we might understand them and what are their implications. And I'd like to address how we as architects could respond to these changes. Can architecture become ecological, and can it go beyond the build and engage with environment as a whole? And let us for the moment enter this title image of a palm oil plantation in Malaysia, an example I will come back to later. And I would like to tell you that arguably architecture hasn't given enough attention to agriculture in recent decades. We know today that nearly half of land area of our planet is dedicated to some form of agricultural production. And agriculture indeed might be the most urgent field to address the problematic of sustainability. And I think Savka has already mentioned that agricultural practices have been linked, to increasing links for climate change, exhaustion of water, natural resources, depletion of soil fertility, disadvantaging local population, affecting quality of life. And the awareness of the consequences of industrialization of agriculture, including addiction to fertilizers, pesticides, fossil fuels, have been growing. So I think it's important that architects become, let's say, knowledgeable and play their part in changing the state of affairs. So I'd like to invite you tonight to consider together with me 3 questions. So first, how are in fact these agri-territories transforming? Second, that I will talk about is how can we conceptualize the relationship of agri-territories and cities or urban centers more generally? And third, how can we approach agri-territories through the perspective of design? So can we think of different scenarios, different possibilities for these landscapes? And I will do so with various examples, mainly studies we did at ETH with our students over the years. So to start with the first question, how are agricultural territories transforming? And I would like to begin with this man. This is John Berger, British intellectual, art critic, and historian, and writer. In 1973, Berger, whom you might know about, left London, where he was born, to live in a tiny hamlet in the French Alps close to Geneva. And his motive was, he wrote, that he realized that subsistence peasant farming, which had sustained humanity for millennia, was drawing to a historical close. He was determined to spend the rest of his life bearing witness to this vanishing existence. Berger argues, and many other Marxist scholars, that small farmers or peasants engaged in subsistence farming have gradually been disappearing in Europe and other parts of the world in a long historical process throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries until today. And subsistence agriculture, according to definition, occurs when farmers grow food to meet the needs of their families or small farms. They produce for survival with relatively little surplus, which they could take to the market. There are estimates that approximately 1.2 billion people today on the planet meets this definition, mostly across the so-called developing countries, and with their numbers continuing to decline. And I've been reading Berger with our students, and these sketches were part of this reading. So what Berger does is not only document the transformation of the disappearance of peasantry through his own experience of living in the Alps, he's interested to capture this disappearing experience of peasants. And he says that peasants, whether they grow rice in Java or corn in South America, are set apart from the rest of urban populations, or historically the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, by life committed to survival. Berger says that peasantry has always supported themselves, but they were also often in different historical moments and contexts exploited, in the sense that they were obliged to hand over their surplus to the feudal lords, for example, or to urban society. In the social pyramid, hierarchical class society, as Berger describes it, peasantry has historically been at the border or at the bottom or just outside the system. The logic of the market or the urban politics has never fully included peasants. They have always had a degree of autonomy, or they were in position to fall back on their own resources. The system offered them always the minimum of protections, and for the rest, they had to look after themselves within their village communes or extended families. Thus, they developed their own laws and codes, rituals and beliefs, orally transmitted transitions, knowledge of medicine and nature, for example. And interestingly, Berger also says that the undeclared relation of this peasant tradition to the dominant class culture, often this is urban culture, was always heretical and subversive. He says that contrary to stereotypes, peasant worldview is profoundly informed. Peasants are the class most conscious of their economic situation, which is rooted in pragmatism and experience of land labor. And further, Berger talks about the history of peasantry in Europe and across the globe, and says that they have been profoundly resilient and have survived under various economic systems. Feudalism, socialism, capitalism, always playing the role of producers at the margins of society. However, he points out that the process of industrial reorganization of economy, which intensifies during the 19th century around the world, has offered the peasant land and physical protection he had not known before, but at the same time, it exposed him to capital and the market economy. So already in the mid-19th century across Western Europe, a great peasant exodus began towards cities, a process known as depeasantization, which is still ongoing, albeit not with the same intensity. Committed to living off the earth, peasant has a different worldview than urban classes, or notably the proletariat. And Berger believes that this worldview is precious, and he frames the difference as culture of survival versus the culture of progress. Peasant, he says, has a cyclic view of time based on nature's rhythms, as opposed to linear time. Peasant is oriented toward the past, not the future. The primary state of justice, as he calls it, is the past. Before the onset of injustice, where he is free, the peasant is free to work without oppression. By contrast, the ideal future for the proletariat is the future without work, the state of leisure, consumerism, abundance, and so on. So Berger tells us that this principle of progress, oriented toward future of plenitude without work, is the underlying ethos of all modernity, whether it is socialist or capitalist. So through this optic, Berger interprets the politics of peasantry. He says that historically, peasants stood outside both the right and the left politics, which are both progress-oriented, and that given the obligation to choose or to vote, let's say, they will tend to opt pragmatically for the side that will protect their interests most in the given moment. And finally, this book, Into Their Labors, among other works of Berger, concludes the disappearance of peasantry is tied to expansion of capitalist economic relations. He says that agriculture today does not necessarily require peasants. Across Europe and the world, this is already visible. And I quote his words, "The British peasantry was destroyed well over a century ago. In France, 150,000 peasants now leave the land every year." This was written in 1990. Economic planners of the European Economic Community envisaged the disappearance of subsistence farmer by the end of the 20th century. Minority of farmers are then transformed into totally different social and economic beings. The capital outlay for intensive mechanization and chemicalization, the necessary size of the farm exclusively producing for the market, the specialization of produce by area, all mean that the peasant family ceases to be a productive and consuming unit, and that instead the peasant becomes the dependent of the interests which both finance him and buy from him. The economic pressure on which such a plan depends is supplied by the falling market value of agricultural produce. For example, in France today, the buying power of the price of the 1 sack of wheat is 3 times less than it was 50 years ago. The ideological persuasion is supplied by all the promises of consumerism. An intact peasantry was the only class with an inbuilt resistance to consumerism. Thereby, this is a valuable experience. And he concludes by saying, when a peasantry is dispersed, markets are enlarged. So with these let's say, introductory remarks, I'd like to show you my first example, Nile Valley, illustrating the process of transformation of an agrarian landscape from, I think, subsistence farming to some form of hybrid economy, which is closer to the market. And as a consequence, the process of urbanization of that landscape. The Nile Valley was the first case of territorial research we worked on at ETH Studio Basel almost 15 years ago. And this case highlights the entanglement of political and environmental questions and the situation of global metabolic interconnectedness. And it shows, I think, astonishingly that even this ancient rural territory is no longer self-sufficient and sustainable, but rather it exists in a precarious state owing to multiple dependencies for food, fuel, and currency comparable to a big city anywhere in the world. To give you a geographic context, the Nile Valley is a 1,000 kilometers long strip. It constitutes 3% of the land area of Egypt and houses 95% of its population. And the first surprise that we encountered was a high population density, which hovers around 2,000 inhabitants per square kilometer, nearly equaling the density of Milan region, for example. The population growth in Egypt has been staggering since the 1960s, going from 30 million at the time to well over 90 million today. Most of this increase has been absorbed within the valley and the delta, so not in big cities such as Cairo, through incremental growth of villages into arable land, following the settlement pattern that is ancient and traced back to pharaonic times. And this was our research area where we traveled with students, 10 by 30 kilometers, and it is actually home, we estimated, to around 500,000 people. Some of the demand for growth, there is a staggering population growth, a lot of that through natural increase, and it is alleviated through expansion into the desert. More than actual solution, this desert in Egypt functions as a kind of a mental frontier, a hope for infinite expansion, both in the realm of individual tactics and in the realm of state strategies. For example, we often encountered small informal land plots made by farmers who build their houses in the valley. They would save soil after they've built their house, and they would bring it to the desert edge, where they would then create new fields irrigated by drawing groundwater. For the state, urbanization of the desert has been a key urban strategy since the initiation of the New Town program under President Anwar al-Sadat in the mid-1970s, when the first desert cities were built around Cairo. However, none of those programs has been successful. I have seen that Charlotte Maltere-Barth's probably already a year ago, talked more on this topic. Despite the efforts, and I'm sure you might have heard about this, according to recent census, only 2.5% of Egypt's population lives in these desert settlements. So despite this enormous effort. And here in the new Asyut, the new city along the Nile Valley, desert city, located just beyond the edge of the valley, we observed all the inherent problems of such new towns, each of them commonplace anywhere in the world. Apartment costs too high, bureaucratic design makes them too small for Egyptian families, the lack of public services and working opportunities. In other words, the desert frontier remains beyond reach. Further, any prospect of either population growth or desert expansion is restrained by the availability of water. On the international level, the Nile water is distributed according to strict water budgets per country, which have already become insufficient. This presents a highly urgent political problem and a constant threat to the security in the region. Within the country, on the national level, the water management system is centralized in Cairo, and water budgets are distributed monthly for every governorate, district, and commune. And even though better irrigation technologies would improve efficiency of water use, it is apparent that further desert expansion and any other urban expansion, as a matter of fact, are highly limited. It seemed paradoxical to us that such a rapid population growth is even possible in what has been a rural area, growth that even appears to exceed the Malthusian limit. Egypt is one of the world's largest importers of wheat, and the practice of government subsidies for bread, fuel, and other necessities, which began in the wake of the Second World War, has endured ever since. In that situation, fluctuations in global market price become equivalent to a natural disaster or a bad harvest, leading to scarcity. For example, bread shortages and resulting riots that occurred, for instance, in 2008 and on other occasions. So this apparent paradox of limitless growth in the condition of limited resources led us to look for reasons behind this remarkable process, the growth process. And the first growth aspect we observed relates to Egypt's land politics. By comparison to European countries and the US, what you see here is that average landholding size in Egypt is small, even miniature, and it has been decreasing over the years, both through inheritance and through agrarian reforms, meant as a state mechanism to halt migration toward the cities. This has functioned as a kind of a stability grid, binding rural masses to the territory and the way of life that in fact cannot provide sufficient means of existence, but it does provide a degree of social, economic, and hence political stability, a kind of a basic income. In this manner, Egypt, I would argue, has created the rural citizen, carrying out through the land redistribution, egalitarian project of modernization comparable to equal access to housing. Second, informal construction also significantly contributes to growth because it forms an independent niche of a country's economy. It is a source of income for many people, and it also became a factor of social and economic stability. Further, together with the previous, the third factor of growth and transformation we observed is a high level of individual mobility. Nearly all citizens have access to a transportation system organized in a kind of a balance between the public, the private, and the informal sectors, sponsored by ongoing fuel subsidies by the state. You can see, for instance, in this illustration that one has only to spend 10% of income on transport in comparison to 60% spent on food. Mobility thus creates a highly elastic condition that overlaps with agricultural base and allows peasants to be at the same time rooted in the valley while earning additional income in urban centers. And finally, there are also social factors such as familial networks that are extremely important. Families are in the Nile Valley still territorial units. And part of their relationships is immigration, very significant in terms of volume and in terms of contribution to remittances, which I think have been estimated even to 80% of economies in such areas, such rural areas. So clearly, all those growth strategies are not just mere phenomena, not an accident, but elaborated political instruments functioning within the environment of limited resources. For Egypt, this growth machine has come at the cost of an almost complete territorial paralysis. Excessive bureaucracy, inefficient agriculture, and omnipresent security are all part of that same picture. The population of the Nile Valley is still tied to its rural roots, but at the same time, it is gradually being urbanized. It is thus an in-between kind of condition, neither rural nor urban. Its tendencies are highly volatile and still unpredictable in the long term. And I think the Nile Valley also portrays, it is not a unique case, but portrays a condition that is relevant in other situations. Let's take, for instance, parts of India where millions of rural populations are expected to urbanize in the coming decades. So if we think back to the question, to the first question I posed at the beginning, how are agrarian territories transforming? And if we think back to the reading of Berger, there are a couple of thoughts or conclusions that we can think of. One of them is that agrarian territory or countryside or a rural condition, however we may call it, is not and never was a single space. It is a wide panorama of extremely diverse conditions, which when absorbed into the market economy also begin to transform in different ways to so to speak, to produce new kinds of specificity. Further, I think that what we can conclude is that the loss of subsistence farming and in a certain landscape may lead to a decline, but as we can see here, it may also lead to growth. We can then observe that urban transformation or urbanization in agricultural areas leads or may lead to a new kind of precarity. So here in Egypt, we can see that rural populations, urban populations, and the state have all become codependent since decades on the politics of food and fuel subsidies and injections of remittances. So we are looking, instead of let's say a self-sufficient systems in agricultural territories, to a highly precarious and unsustainable systems. And finally, The urban fabric and urban society emerging under these conditions is highly uneven, unequal. Urbanization is conflictual, and it is not a process that of itself produces a more just space or a better life. So these hybrid rural-urban conditions, I would say, represent in today's world a norm rather than an exception. And there is a huge and interesting task for architects in terms of understanding these spaces and relationships. The second question we asked in the beginning of the talk is, what is the relationship of agrarian territories to cities? And here I'd like to start with the work of historian of territory William Cronon, tracing the rise of Chicago as an industrial metropolis and the center of America's Great West from 1850s onward. Cronon says that during the second half of the 19th century, the American landscape was transformed in ways that anticipated many of the environmental problems we face today. Large-scale deforestation, threats of species extinction, unsustainable exploitation of natural resources, widespread destruction of habitat. It was during this period as well that much of the world we now inhabit was created. The great cities that house so many of us, the remarkably fertile farmlands that feed us, the transportation linkages that tie our countries together, the market institutions that help define our relationship to each other and to the natural world that is our larger home. The 19th century saw the creation of an integrated economy in the United States, Cronon writes, an economy that bound the city and the country into a powerful national and international market that forever altered human relationships to the land. Although Cronon's work is focused on Chicago and the Great West, its broader ambition is to explore those century-old economic and ecological transformations that have continued to affect landscapes of the North and the rest of the world. He writes that few of us actually fully understand or appreciate how much of our modern landscape is a creation of these 19th century changes. For cultural reasons that date from the same historical period, we have long tended to see city and country as separate places, more isolated from each other than connected. We carefully partition our national landscapes into urban places, rural places, and wilderness. Although we often cross the symbolic boundaries between them, seeking escape or excitement, recreation or renewal, we actually rarely reflect on how tightly bound together they really are. Still, Cronon believes that city and country have a common history, so their stories are best told together. Thus, he brings us to the onset of intensive industrialization processes in the mid-19th century Chicago and the Midwest. He speaks, among other themes, of globalization of hinterlands through railway networks, shipping, refrigeration, and other new technologies. And he speaks of the ways in which cities and landscapes, including agricultural landscapes, are connected and they co-produce each other in these conditions until today. So he argues that these processes that have been triggered through industrialization in the mid-19th century are essentially the ones that whose continuation we are experiencing until today. Ultimately, the question also that Cronon poses is whether this process is productive. Are cities worth the environmental price being paid, or have countries, in fact, become a kind of a unforgiving infrastructural backlot, and in fact are paying the price for sustaining a life of leisure and consumption in cities. So all of this is explored in this book, Nature's Metropolis, from 1992. I would now like to, continuing from the remarks on Cronon and on industrialization of agricultural territories, to enter my second example, second case, exploration of what an agrarian or food hinterland is today, on the example of Singapore, where I have also had the privilege to work with my students and team since several years. First, I would define hinterland similar to Cronon as a type of territory which involves economical incorporation and mobilization of land and resources with the given urban center. And for us, Singapore stood out as a unique case, ideally suited for this kind of study, because Singapore is, as you know, a city-state built on a constricted land area without any natural resources and without agricultural land whatsoever. Methodologically, going beyond the city into, let's say, a hinterland research involves a moment that Cronon also talks about, a recognition that perception and representation of all remote territories from nature to countrysides has historically always been initiated from urban perspective. The periphery has always been imagined from the viewpoint of the center. So we, in sort of crossing that symbolic boundary from the city to the countryside or to the hinterland, we are also in a way leaving behind the various city-centric tendencies or an urban bias. For example, in Singapore, a political imaginary of Singapore as a model for urbanization for the rest of Asia. So to be able to decenter such ideas, to open up alternatives and kind of different ways of looking, we introduce this idea of the eclipse as a conceptual maneuver, and in a which allowed us was an idea of eclipsing the city in the narrow sense as an object of study, and instead observing its impact on the territory only from the outside, so to speak. So in this shifting perspective, looking out and looking beyond the city and looking at the city from the outside, we found, let's say, a possibility to bring new spaces and phenomena into the field of vision. And here, of course, we have to start with the space of global shipping, which extends in front of Singapore along the Singapore Strait and the Strait of Malacca. This is one of the most intense maritime passages in the world. 90% of the world's traded goods pass along this corridor every year, and it has certainly functioned as a kind of a lifeline which afforded Singapore its unique geopolitical advantage and the status as a global city. So certainly the straits of Singapore presents a kind of a backbone of Singapore's hinterland phenomenon. As mentioned, Singapore is one of the densest cities in the world without natural resources. In comparison, it is about 10 times the density of the canton of Zurich. I could imagine also Prague would be around the same mark, so close to 10 times would be around 8,000 people per square kilometer. It is also a profoundly enclosed city on the political equator. We compared it to West Berlin before the fall of the wall, and observed that in terms of numbers of border crossings, Singapore today is even more enclosed than West Berlin. An important dimension of Singapore's urbanization is traced back to the 1970s and 80s, when Singapore, one of 4 Asian tigers at the time, whose economic boom had been based on industrial manufacturing, began outsourcing part of that manufacturing across the border into the neighboring Malaysia and Indonesia, particularly the borderland cities called Johor and Batam. Dozens of industrial parks created at the time in these borderlands under Singaporean management then attracted huge labor migrations from other parts of the countries, triggering tremendous urbanization process across Singapore's borderlands and in its shadow, so to speak. Today, we are actually looking at a little known reality in which cities you probably have not heard about before. Johor and Batam have actually each exceeded 1.5 million inhabitants, and they continue growing. It is foreseen that by 2030 already, their working population will match that of Singapore. Thus, in very near future, it is expected that a different dynamic will be encountered there, a tripartite figure of more equal cities will prevail over that, let's say, figure that is centered on the city-state. These are images of urbanization around industrial parks at Singapore's borders. And here I would like to say that through ethnographic fieldwork in these hinterlands, in these borderlands, so travel, direct experience, lived encounters, we actually researched or followed 5 resource flows vital for Singapore: sand, water, food, labor, and oil. And this is footage of one such visit to a small Indonesian port on the southern side of the straits, which supplies fish to Singapore. As you can see on this graph, all of the mentioned resources except water are sourced mainly from abroad, and they also arrive from large distances in Asia and from other continents. So food is 95% imported from various distances. We looked mainly, what we were able to visit were the sites in the region where food is produced in the tri-national region. We looked at the manner in which food is collected and distributed and the manner in which those sites are dependent on Singapore. We found striking the contrast in agricultural landscapes on the 2 sides of the border. What you see in the images is Johor, Malaysia, where one finds huge sites of industrial production, for example, huge vegetable farms that you see here covered with nets, or the landscapes of palm oil plantations that I mentioned, which extend across Malay Peninsula all the way to Kuala Lumpur. These landscapes, in fact, have been colonized under British Empire during the 19th century for the production of rubber, pepper, game beer by means of migrant labor from other parts of the empire. And in fact, palm oil represents here the second generation of plantation agriculture that has been introduced by the Malaysian state after Malaysian independence in the 1950s as a way of empowering the landless under developmentalist narratives, and similar to the case we have seen in Egypt under Nasser. So in this drawing, you actually see settlers' villages that are built amidst these enormous fields of monoculture. So village is here a state project and a spatial product of industrialization and modernization of the economy, a socioeconomic infrastructure, a means of settling the land. Palm oil has been based on dispossession of indigenous populations, of settlers, on migrant labor from other countries in Southeast Asia, and also on a network of Malaysian and international processing and trade corporations such as Sime Darby, Wilmer, and others that are housed in Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and other centers, and which deliver palm oil as a major commodity to the global markets. And by contrast to such industrialized landscapes, in Singapore, one finds on tiny sites which only constitute 1% of the total land area, one finds what we could call urban agriculture, extremely constricted in the high density. There are several agri-technology parks focused on vertical farming, but one also finds areas where agriculture appears in the function of urban leisure, education, and perhaps also represents a form of nostalgia for Singapore before intensive urbanization, and perhaps even represents a latent form of resistance. During the study, or in parallel with those ethnographies, we also created some diagrammatic notations based around selected notions such as infrastructure or metabolism or extraction and so forth that you see here, in order to be able to compare the different hinterlands that we looked at. And one can read, in addition to some of those points that I have mentioned, one can read, for instance, that more than 90% of Singapore's food comes from abroad, that this includes even dairy from New Zealand and beverages from France. There are such curiosities as in exports. Singapore even exports agricultural products. These are cut orchids and ornamental fish. And at the same time, a number of farms in Singapore and domestic agricultural surface have declined tremendously over the years, together with income from agriculture. In terms of development over time, it was interesting for us that this food hinterland has a distinct geography. In comparison to other resources, sand, for example, which is mainly regional, food hinterland has developed after the Second World War on two scales that are both regional and global. And this has been determined by technologies, namely the cold chain. So the regional scale is in fact linked to live animal imports and perishable goods, foods, which come from nearby areas in Malaysia and Indonesia, whereas the global scale is realized through shipping and through air cargo, and it relates to frozen foods, processed foods, and so on. And as I mentioned, during the 20th century in Singapore and most other cities, as a matter of fact, there has been a steady decline of agricultural footprint. And today only 1% of the land area is dedicated to agriculture. So this is less actually than the area currently occupied in Singapore by golf courses. You will see in 1947 on the diagram that there is one exception to this timeline. During the Second World War and the Japanese occupation, Singapore was actually forced into agricultural labor and to a kind of a form of autarky and self-sufficiency of growing food within the boundaries of the island. And here in images, you see that same timeline starting in the late 19th century with plantation landscapes of the British colonial period through that brief moment of autarky during the Japanese occupation. Further to the 1980s, when Singapore begins to phase out domestic agriculture in line with policies of international institutions at the time, promoting globalization of food trade. And also in line with some hygienic and I would say aesthetic considerations and contradictions that agriculture posed to the aspirations of urban life. And instead of domestic food production, what Singapore embraced is actually specialized high-earning forms of agriculture, such as vertical farms or ornamental agriculture. In other words, the kind of production where not the food, but in fact agricultural technology or other luxury products are foregrounded as main values to be produced and exported. So this tendency of focusing on a higher earning forms of agriculture in areas where land rents are high is of course very common and found around the world. So the regional hinterland was accessible to our investigations and was relatively simple to trace by following the food flows. And essentially, the region supplies fresh and chilled produce to Singaporean supermarkets. This was organized in a straightforward manner. The farmers whose business was phased out of Singapore in 1980s were encouraged to migrate to Malaysia, to Johor, where they were allowed to purchase and lease land and were offered incentives by both governments. And many of them now operate large farms with secure contracts to Singaporean supermarkets while still being able to maintain a legal address in Singapore and export their various products under Singaporean brand. So here you see these two brothers, Singaporean Chinese, who run Hokwi orchid nurseries in Malaysia, based on migrant labor from Bangladesh and other countries. They were actually very helpful in our research. And in contrast to this regional picture, the global food hinterland was, in fact, much more complex and dynamic, mainly as a consequence of the way we set up our research. And due to the complexity and the speed of rearrangement of supply chains, it is harder or impossible to portray the actual physical metabolic dependencies between territories. And also simply and often information linking particular produce from the sites of origin to the sites of consumption is simply not available. So we looked at a couple of indicators that help us approximate the picture. On the top left, you see the land area of Singapore that is dedicated to agriculture. This is this 1 pixel of agricultural land on the island. And further, in green circle is a surface we drew through the NGO data showing foreign acquisition of agricultural land by Singapore abroad. This involves purchase, lease, or other types of secure long-term contracts over land areas. This data also shows that a lot of protagonists here are palm oil companies. The second widespread indicator is the food footprint, which shows us the land area needed to support an average carnivore population in the city. And third is the more speculative indicator, the so-called ecological footprint, which is the total estimated demand of a city such as Singapore projected on the surface of the earth. And finally, in terms of geopolitics of food, Singapore, we learned, opted for a strategy of securing food at the source. And here you can see a comparison of foreign land acquisitions among Singapore, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. Clearly, all very different. Singapore, by contrast to Switzerland, by contrast to Singapore, opts, in fact, for a high proportion of domestic production. Securing food at the source in Singapore involves setting up bilateral contracts with governments worldwide, including, for example, Brazil and China. Example of such bilateral project is illustrated on the bottom of the slide. It is a Sino-Singaporean joint food zone or a super farm, so-called, in the north of Beijing, for which the contract was signed at the highest level by Prime Minister of both countries. So what we have learned is that Singapore is a country whose food hinterland and other hinterlands I have mentioned have been progressively disintegrated and dispersed around the world at various scales. However, the question remained of that proximate regional space or regional hinterland in the sense of William Cronon's Chicago and the Great West. And we wanted to have a greater clarity of Singapore's impact in the immediate region. And these explorations actually gradually coalesced into a cartographic thesis, where our intention was also to counter the conventional division of the territory or the region in three countries, and instead to construct a new map of the cross-border metropolitan region, where this map would also serve as a provocation and a suggestion of a possible new reality. And with this regional map, we also wanted to link the resource territories or hinterlands. We studied with urbanization processes in the region through the direct experience of the territory, and also through cartography. We described the 6 territories of urbanization that you see here. First, the figure of the 3 national metropolis, showing the 3 cities in 3 different countries that are practically interconnected. Then, interesting figure for you might be the urbanized sea and air, involving the space of shipping, logistics, and technological zones that occupy coastal areas. And in the context of our talk, the figure we want to look at is the one in yellow, industrial primary production, which involves palm oil in the north, and also a more surprising figure in the green color at the bottom, what we call the quiet archipelago, which actually consists of predominantly indigenous kampong towns and settlements, which now resemble rural areas under pressure to urbanize and are comparable, for instance, to mountainous areas in Europe. So they are losing their population to cities, they are as I mentioned, experiencing the process of loss of peasantry or the rural to urban migration. And so this is the full thesis map and the counter paradigm to this mainstream political imagination of Singapore as a global city-state or a city without a hinterland, as one often hears in this region. Instead, we propose to recast Singapore as a metropolitan region extending across the border and actually region as an overlooked space of potentials. So to conclude briefly on the second case, what is the relationship of Agriterritories to the city? I have in fact shown two perspectives. One, where food territories of hinterlands are described as multiscalar through the resource flows, and the others where food hinterlands are seen as regional proximate spaces. And in Singapore, we actually learned that the choice between these two is not just a technical problem or a matter of scalar difference, but it is actually first and foremost the question of a political orientation, a political vision. It represents an enduring dilemma of political geography. Jean Gottman, French geographer, put it in the following way. Do we want our cities to be smaller, inward-looking, striving for autarky, as Plato famously wished for his ideal city republic? Or do we want our cities to be global, network, pluralistic, open to all manner of trade and exchange, as was the vision of Alexander the Great, the disciple of Aristotle? Thereby, Gottman named these two contrasting positions on the city hinterland, Platonic and Alexandrine. Singapore, of course, and most of the cities of the global north are today on the Alexandrine side of the spectrum. Large part, I believe, of the public discourse around sustainability supports today the idea of shifting this model back in the direction of Platonic city, which involves shortening and better governance over supply chains, as well as the idea of regenerative material cycling and the kind of a regional model against, let's say, destructive forms of urban accumulation. And I believe here that metropolitan regions are better scales than cities to address these various questions. In particular, the metabolic questions. These are open figures which contain resources and where we have a chance to design reparative, regenerative ecologies that support urban life. So in the regional scale, I believe we can seek the contours of a new urban project. And I also wanted to address the third question for tonight. As I announced, how could we approach agrarian territories from the perspective of design? I will introduce it, but due to the fact that I have perhaps gone a little bit over my time, I will wrap up quicker. But I think leaving, to say so, enough material for discussion. So the perspective of design. It is interesting, and I mentioned that architecture has possibly been neglecting agriculture in recent decades. This was not always the case. There are many precedents of agrarian design in let's say, architecture and urbanism or agri-urbanism, from Garden City and Broadacre City to Doxiadis, Ecumenopolis, and the work of Ian McHarg, to mention some of the most prominent examples. But I would like to introduce the proposal of ETH Studio Basel. Architects Herzog, de Meuron, Roger Diener, and Marcel Miley, and geographer Christian Schmid, which is close to me, or I had a chance to work, let's say, in this context. And Studio Basel made an argument in the case of Switzerland that architects essentially need to reconceptualize our understanding of territory as a whole in order to be able to envision its future. And they explain that the historic fabric of the territory, in the case of Switzerland, the cellular structures of communes and their villages has been changed through urbanization processes. And they wrote about their observation that especially in the second half of the 20th century, urbanization processes have in fact obliterated the power of the commune and have eroded this fabric of territory and fabric of differences of Switzerland. In other words, commune is no longer effective as it used to be as a political and territorial unit. Its autonomy and power of self-government is undermined and eroded. And this also encompasses other historic experiences of the communes, such as management of the common pool resources or commons such as water resources, pastures, forests, and so on. The weakening of the commune is due to many factors over time: movement of people, goods, capital, technology, in networks and scales that exceed the capacity of the commune. In other words, urbanization processes essentially operate at the scales that let's say, surpasses the scale of the commune. And this, in fact, is points to the crisis of the local, the crisis of local governance. And in that sense, it is also a crisis of design as a manifestation of coordinated democratic political action. And what Studio Basel proposed is a thesis on urbanization of Switzerland, represented cartographically. Their statement was that we cannot conceive contemporary Switzerland any longer through urban-rural binary or city-landscape binary, as I have, let's say, repeated also and pointed throughout the talk several times. Instead, they propose to understand Switzerland as a completely urbanized country, where purely rural space or practice no longer exists, and where historical rural experience has in fact diminished over time. Instead, they have outlined 5 distinct territories of urbanization in different geographies of the country. And as you can see on the image, they are metropolitan regions, Zurich, Basel, and Geneva, Lausanne. They have further outlined a network of cities which are which have a lower degree of international interconnectedness. These are, for instance, Lucerne and even Bern. They further outlined the quiet zones. These are areas of agrarian areas or countryside close to the cities that are under pressure to urbanize. And they have further spoken about two kinds of tendencies of transformation in the Alps. On the one hand, alpine resorts that are dedicated to tourism and that exhibit also growth through tourist economy. And on the other hand, alpine fallow lands where we are in fact witnessing decline and loss of population in the mountainous villages. And it is interesting here that the countryside or the historic villages and village cores can actually be found in every one of these 5 categories. Historic villages are today exposed to and absorbed within very different kinds of figures or parts of very different kinds of urbanization processes in Switzerland and elsewhere. So on the one hand, we may be looking at the shrinking villages in alpine fallow lands, or those villages that are transformed through tourism in the Alps, or villages being absorbed within metropolitan networks and so on. In each case, the kind of ways in which those villages and their actually agricultural landscape change are very different. It is thus very important to look closely and to find out what kind of transformations we are observing. And this argumentation is elaborated in this book, a study from 2005, Switzerland, an urban portrait, and several other publications, including Achtung die Landschaft, which argues that urban areas can no longer be designed only through the focus on the built-up areas, but fundamentally, we also have to design open, unbuilt lands, including agriculture and including agricultural ecology. So I'm watching the time, and I would like to, at this moment, thank you for your attention and hope we can have an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Milica. It was really nice. If you have some questions, you can write to the chat. But I have a question or actually just, I would like to mention that what I actually mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, what is the relationship of the rural countryside or cities hinterland to the in developing countries and between the countryside in already developed countries. So for example, in developing countries, the countryside is kind of very contradictory, erased from the city structure based on agricultural production and not control. While in developed countries like Europe, the countryside is a controlled landscape of production and consumption, and it actually contributes to the cultural heritage of the citizens. So in developing countries like it is Balkan, let's say, we have these territories under huge neoliberal exploitation, land reclamation, or exhaustion of natural resources. So one of the current example can be like the project in cooperation with Rio Tinto to create mines as an exhaustion of lithium in the river valley of Drina. And it is very specific natural environment, the rural poor area. So my question is how could we actually increase the interest of urban police or the interest of architects actually to protect or to control this kind of development in developing countries, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to say it?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I am Serbian, and I have studied some of those phenomena in the Balkan. I'm familiar with that whole landscape, and I think you are right to say that first of all, the kind of idea of what is a cultural landscape is probably weaker than in the west of Europe at the moment. Also, the importance of nature protection and ecology, and also the kind of, let's say, legal apparatus that would help introduce or let's say develop those landscapes is still very weak. So one of the problems, of course, in the countries in the so-called transition is that you know, legal apparatus or the planning apparatus is simply not developed or not completed to the point to even be able to you know, that such principles could be implemented. And you know, there are of course various other problems. Let's say incomplete cadastre, you know, the kind of property complications, economic weaknesses, which means that, you know, funds cannot be allocated for the nature protection. Also, lack of let's say a discipline or perhaps trust in the institutions to follow the law, etc., etc., etc. So many problems that in fact are problems, I think, of governance in for instance the post-socialist countries of the Balkans. So I think that these are not really problems of design. I mean, these are I think problems of those recent experiences, political experiences, territorial upheavals, you know, lack of trust in institutions, etc., etc. I think that what we can do as architects, and I think we should do, is I would say promote a certain kind of culture of landscape. Right. And I think that with that, so basically spreading ideas, inspiration, and, you know, helping with, you know, giving to say so our contribution in the kind of a really process of I would say the kind of consolidation of, let's say, spatial practices, you know, which needs in these regions, which needs to be much wider. I mean, I have due to the shortness of time, I have skipped my Swiss example, and there I in fact show something very different, which is that in fact the kind of highly regulated situations also have their problems, in the sense that laws can be stifling and can also lead to very absurd kind of practices, which everybody is forced to follow, you know, even if they don't want to, or, you know, people being forced to find ways to or a certain kind of degrees of freedom that are just outside the law, you know, otherwise let's say you know, urban life or experience of landscape and so on becomes very stifling. So so these are very different kind of problems by contrast to Balkan that are experienced in a highly regulated and let's say disciplined a kind of landscapes and societies such as Switzerland.
You're also like author of one of the book concerning the Belgrade urban transformation, right? The post-socialist urban transformation of land. Could you tell us something more about it, maybe?
Yes, this indeed, this book concerned, it's called Formal, Informal, and it concerns the post-socialist urban transformation of Belgrade as a kind of central case, but in fact, the experience of Belgrade, I think, is not unique, and elements of that post-socialist transformation are, I think, found across the cities in the Balkan and even in some of the post-Soviet countries.
Mm-hmm.
Or, for example, Albania shares elements of that experience, Bulgaria, and so on. So what we have shown is that even let's say in the situation of the collapse of socialist state, where let's say a wide variety of urban functions, from housing to commerce to transport and so on, are orchestrated informally without participation of public institutions, and you know, the consequences of that situation in let's say urban space and I think in the social sphere. And of course I think we have also experienced a certain kind of normalization, you know, since you know, since the 1990s until today, but some aspects of that situation are still valid. So I would say that in terms of let's say urban functions, our cities in the Balkans are still, let's say, partly informal or have been informalized, and parts of that informality are in fact or have become legitimized or have been co-opted for various political purposes, and it is now in a way informality has become a kind of a, as I have shown in Egypt, a kind of a form of social stability, or a you know, form of economic right, which is then a very difficult to disembed and to arrive to kind of new habits and new, to say so, governance arrangements. So in a way, informality becomes a kind of legitimate way of governing through that experience.
Mm-hmm. And as you said in the beginning, like what is the role of architect in, not just in designing these territories, but in actually in understanding and describing these terms. It's really like for me useful, and it was like nice to see that just by mapping or observation, you could address like a lot of problematics of sustainability and agri-territories.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that these large scales, and arguably the kind of territorial scale has been neglected. So when I said that agriculture has been neglected in architecture, perhaps in the last couple of decades, and that this was not the case before. You have probably seen or heard that about that recent countryside exhibition in Guggenheim by Rem Koolhaas and his team, and he says a very interesting thing, that he believes that indeed countryside was an important field of action of many state regimes. If we want to look historically, Tito's Yugoslavia was very interested and had very explicit policies in the countryside. You know, Stalin, Soviet Union, Mao's China, etc., etc. Countryside was a field of operation also for modern architects. You know, whether we talk about you know, Nasser or Malaysia, we have seen these projects of state, to say so, industrialization in the countryside through land distribution, through kind of construction of infrastructure, through construction of villages and other infrastructures to serve, let's say, industrial production in the countryside. Of course, under very aggressive and today unacceptable, as I said, developmentalist narratives about, you know, let's say, activating unproductive land, which in fact entailed the kind of expulsion of indigenous population, dispossession, etc., etc. However, Koolhaas, as I mentioned, he observed that and spoke about it in an interview, that in fact these territories have also experienced a kind of neoliberalization in the sense that state has withdrawn its interest from the countryside in the last, let's say, 30, 40 years, since the 1980s. So we have not seen the kind of grand projects or grand narratives, except perhaps, you know, if we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative and so on, you know, where we still don't see how explicitly this relates to the transformation in agricultural territories. So I think it is there has been a kind of a vacuum, I would say, politically and conceptually around let's say, thinking and planning the countryside, right? And there I fully agree with this, with the observation of Koolhaas. So in a way, the let's say, the neoliberal period, I think, has underlined the kind of focus on cities, or perhaps promoted the ideology of cities as places of, you know, density, innovation, consumption, etc., etc., places of opportunity. And I think that this resulting neglect, you know, for the countryside is something that is, I would say, a big task, an interesting task, and an urgent task that you know, that we should be working on.
Also, one of the really nice examples, maybe, of the 20th century, when you're mentioning, is this like project called Agronica, or from Andrea Branzi.
Yes.
And I would say he also like used this kind of like observation or urbanism as a powerful medium for this, actually understanding these problematics of neoliberal exploitation and the land values.
Yes, Branzi is interesting, and I agree. This is a very interesting project. I mean, he's a very, I think, unique figure as a designer, because unique in the sense that he had this idea of weak urbanization. So he was. I think it's still contemporary, or it resonates in the sense that he believes in technology that would allow to intervene in a manner that is ecological, that is soft, that is not heavy-handed, that we can, I think Branzi's design is somehow to put those buildings lightly on very thin legs and to never, to say so, harm, you know, the land or any other ecosystem that we are you know, that we are, to say so, living or constructing in. So I think that this particular idea is still in a way utopian, because this kind of wonderful technology is perhaps still not fully available, but we always dream that it will arrive. So, but it's nevertheless a kind of a beautiful and inspiring image that Gronica offers.
Yeah. I guess we are like actually a lot, long, but yeah, thank you a lot for the lecture. I really hope that
thank you so much. I hope that it is a very, I have to say, I've given now a few Zoom lectures, and it's always very strange. I mean, I'm speaking more, and it's also very
strange to kind of like influence people to kind of discuss more. And
but
so we hope we can like invite you for some like normal like personal.
I would love to. I mean, I have you know, I mean, I'm very interested in what you do, but I'm also interested in Prague, and in fact in the whole Czech Republic. And you know, there were some ideas about researching also countryside over there. So maybe you know, Bohemia or something like that. That was always a kind of an interesting story. So I'd love to you know, I'd love to visit, in fact, for real, and
that will be for sure.
And perhaps travel around also. Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, we are also looking forward to. So I guess like there are no questions.
Great. I see now Michaela and Jana. Thank you. It's great to meet you, ladies.
Hope to see you one time.
Yeah,
here in Prague.
That's yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mean, likewise. I'm not sure if you're visiting Switzerland, but please, you know, drop me a line when you're coming, and I'd love to host you back here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice night.
You too. You too. Greetings from Zurich.